Hey everyone, welcome to the Behavior Trap Podcast featuring your host Alan Loeb. The Behavior Trap Podcast is an interview-based format show that features everyday ambitious behavior analysts that are currently working towards getting their certificate or already have one. I believe every behavior analyst is making a difference, and well, I want to hear how they got there, what school was like, what they would do differently, and finally, what they're doing now. Hey Shane, how are you today?
Good, man. How are you?
I am pretty excited. It's Super Bowl Sunday, and I'm excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here, man. I was talking to somebody today, and I was like, I don't even know what a 49er is. Like, I used to follow football, and, I was a Steelers fan, and I didn't even know who was in the Super Bowl today. That's how far removed I am now. But I was even thinking about it. I was like, what is a 49er? I don't know that I have an answer yet, so I got to figure that out today. That's good. That's my goal for today. That's like my one new bit of information I'm going to learn today.
Do you have someone in mind that you want to win today, the Chiefs or the 49ers?
Well, so I don't have a preference. I think from the standpoint of the team that's being less controversial, I would say the 49ers probably. But with that being said, I don't know who is doing what or who's the better team so I'm really not even, I'm that far removed that I don't have a preference.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we'll go ahead and get into the show. And one of the first questions I always ask is, what got you into behavioral analysis?
Oh man, I love this question. It's such a fun one because I think everybody's story is so cool. So my story is not quite that interesting, but the path was kind of strange. So when I first started in the field, when I was about fourth and fifth grade, I had a buddy of mine who had CP, and I watched him struggle through classes because he understood the content, he understood the material, but he was still treated like less than among the peer group. And I was always a big advocate for people who had special needs and those challenges during that time. I stood up for them, I hung out with them and stuff like that. And then as I got older, in high school, I was trying to get my scholarship. So I was volunteering with Special Olympics for a little bit and doing some work there, which was really cool. And then had this really crazy year in my life where I went to school. I was going to be a marine biology major. I ended up dropping out of college 3 times. And then in the same year, I ended up getting married, having a baby, getting divorced, dropping back out of college, and then had this whole crazy thing happen. And then so when I went back to school, to be a drug counselor. I was going for clinical psychology. And so as part of that experience, I had to do an internship. And, for anybody who doesn't know, or I'm sure you've experienced this, everywhere that you work that's got a psychology requirement or a psychology degree, anything like that, they're like, you need 2 years of experience. So it's like, but I can't get 2 years of experience if I don't have a job. So had to figure out how to do my internship within that. And so I started interning as a case manager. And I was doing this for a little bit and was reviewing a treatment plan. And my internship site supervisor had asked me, what do you want to do with this internship? And I was actually reading a treatment plan, like a behavior analytic treatment plan at the time. And so I'm reading it and I was like, oh, this behavior analysis thing sounds cool. And that's literally what I had said. And she made a phone call, and I got hired to work at an agency as like a pre-RBT or like a proto-RBT type of thing. I got hired that day from a phone call because I was large enough that I could take a punch. So that's how I started in behavior analysis. Was I just kind of fell right into it.
See, it's kind of interesting that you brought up the whole experience thing, because I have a friend who works in IT now, but he went back to school and just got his associates just so he could work at the place. Like they said, hey, you need experience, but since you're in school, you can work here. But if you didn't have experience, you can't work here. It's like, what? Like,
it's very strange.
So I find that pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I understand it because, when you're working with human lives, you want somebody who's got like a skill set or has previous exposure. It can be really intense. And especially the guys that I work with who are all like crisis cases. Like I specialize working with adults in crisis and really intense cases in forensics and sex offenders and all that realm. And so you can't just put anybody in there. And I mean, there are behavior analysts that have been in the field for years that you can't just put in there. So it makes sense. Like in that regard. But I mean, you work with like younger kids, it's got a little bit of verbal behavior type of thing, and they're pretty easygoing. 2 years is not as important, I don't think. So I think we lose a little bit of the context in that. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to see that.
So currently, are you an RBT, BCBA? Do you hold a doctorate?
So I am a BCBA. I've been a BCBA since 2012, and I recently, as of May 2019, completed my PhD. So I am a doctoral level. I'm actually so my degree is in clinical psychology, and so I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and I'm a BCBA.
Congrats, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a hell of a journey.
Oh, I can imagine. What school did you attend for, I guess, both programs?
So my journey was a little bit complex. Funny enough, I graduated from University of Phoenix with my associates, my bachelor's, and my first master's. So I went there. That was about all I could do because I was a single dad for a while, and so that's about as convenient as it could get. And so when I decided to go back to school, I went to Walden University for my PhD. And what ended up happening, and this is just kind of, everybody calls me the absent-minded professor. What ended up happening was I signed up for this program. I completed a requirement within it, and I ended up getting a second master's degree accidentally. So like one day a master's degree showed up at my doorstep, and it was for this other program. So I actually have two master's degrees, one by accident. And which everybody's like, how does that happen? And I'm just kind of an idiot about that. But my behavior analytic coursework I completed through FIT. So I did their certificate program in 2010, 2011, and completed all the requirements around then.
What inspired you to continue your education following your second master's?
So it's twofold. So the lighter side was that I always thought the name Dr. Spiker sounded really cool. So I was like, I'm just going to get my doctorate just so people call me Dr. Spiker. And just so I can make my enemies call me Dr. Spiker, because I'm too nice to make people call me Dr. Spiker, but people I don't like, I'll make them call me Dr. Spiker. So that was kind of a funny thing and kind of a weird one-off thing. But I actually went to school. I went back because I was getting hurt a lot at work, and not because I was messing up with interventions or anything. It was just the guys that I worked with were really intense. I mean, I had been knocked out cold over a can of soda. I mean, there would be weeks where I'd have to take off because of pretty severe injuries. And I just kind of had this revelation one day that I can't do that forever. I simply cannot take the hits and take the beatings for the rest of my life. And so, as part of that, I was like, well, I love the science. I love what we do. What can I do going beyond that? And academia is to me, the next most logical jump. And so, because I never want to own my own agency, but academia was the next thing. So, okay, professorship and all that. And in order to do that and really move up the ranks and do all that, you have to have some doctorate level degree. So that's a lot of where it's coming from, is like more of a retirement plan than anything else.
I don't know if you're into like cartoons or like Marvel or anything, but Dr. Spiker kind of has that feel to it. It's like Dr. Spiker.
Yeah.
It's pretty sweet.
It's a superhero name, man. I was telling people, it's like, it's in people, people will say like, oh, it's a cool name. I'm like, I was born with it. That's all I can say, because it was, I've heard that my entire life, that it's like a cool name. And so hopefully it's not like a Dr. Doom type of situation. But hopefully it's more like Dr. Reed Richards or something along those lines, some kind of superhero. I try to be, at least.
Yeah, for sure. So we can kind of go into, I know you said you got 2 masters and you got your doctorate. But what was your day-to-day routine life comparing your master's to your doctorate?
So I tell people not to follow me as an exemplar, because I was a horrible grad student. I made myself a bet that I could get through my PhD program without ever opening a textbook. And I did do that. I got my material and my studies and all that stuff elsewhere, and I definitely studied the stuff and practiced the stuff. But I was not a great student. I was never a great studier. And I'm also one of those people that when I learn a concept, I got it like right then and there. And so once I feel comfortable with a concept, I never really forget it. Like if you were to ask me about because you're in grad school now and you've probably touched on this stuff. If you're asking me about verbal behavior and which ones come under control of the MOs versus SDs, I could tell you MANs and stuff like that. And that's kind of like the simple, basic verbal behavior stuff. But when you get into like CMOs, like I can explain a CMO without any problem at all, because I spend so much, like I learned it really quickly. So I don't know, I didn't really study, and I think that makes people mad. So I try to tell people, like, grad school is hard, but don't trust my experience. My experience was very different.
Yeah, see, I'm just imagining myself now leaving this podcast and going downstairs. Hey, babe, I just talked to Dr. Spiker, and he told me I don't have to study.
Yeah, and I try to tell people, like, don't listen to that. It's the worst advice, because it's hard work, and I mean, you are messing with people's lives. So I would say, and also too, I will say that part of that is like necessity for me. Like when I was studying, I was not, I did not have the luxury of being able to go to school without having to work. Like I had to work a literal full-time job, do my supervision at the same time. I managed caseloads when I was doing my master's degree. Just as an example, for my PhD, while I was finishing it up, I had a full-time job where I was in charge of 250 active families receiving services, 150 staff. I was teaching at 2 different colleges, and I was, I'm father of 2, and I have a family now, and I have all this stuff. I mean, like realistically, I shouldn't have been able to complete my PhD. So fortunately, I'm one of those people that can lay on a textbook and absorb all the information.
I'll read an article, but sometimes I kind of engage in mindless reading. I'm like, I'll get halfway through it and be like, what was this about? Like, yeah. I don't know. I have to really tune into the material for me to actually learn the concepts.
Yeah. I mean, and honestly, like a lot of our research is it does not make for a stimulating read. So if you ever try to read JAB, it's like reading an entirely different language.
Well, if you've seen the new 2020 winter edition, it's thick, and I think I may have saw your picture on Instagram.
Yeah, with 2 C's, dude. It is insane. I like the idea, but it is a thick book. It's 600 pages.
Yeah. I haven't looked into it yet, but I read half of the beginning where it talked about like the big idea article, so I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a Dostoevsky book. Like you pick up like Crime and Punishment, and it is like the same level of thickness. It's crazy.
So kind of going back for a second, how long did it take you to get your doctorate then?
It took I would say about 5 years altogether. My program was pretty intense, so I had to complete some coursework. I had to do residency, which my residency ended up being about 60 days altogether. I had to travel to Minnesota for my residency, so I was there every 3 months for the better part of a year. And so, so it was, that part was a lot of work. I mean, it was a lot of hands-on, and I certainly don't want to downplay the fact that like your like graduate programs are tough and they are hard work, and you have to pour yourself into them. So, it was a lot of work, and I'm glad it's done. My dissertation was a lot of work too, but glad it's done. So
for sure. So you can choose which one you want to go into, but who's your supervisor during either master's program or doctorate?
Yeah. So for supervision, I had I always cite 3 people specifically as the as like influencing my experience. I had one direct supervisor that is considered like my formal supervisor. Her name's Dawn Namoli, and she's based out of Daytona Beach in that area. And she taught me a whole lot about what it means to be very clear in what you're saying and in documenting and covering yourself when things go wrong. And another thing that she really taught me was like, when you're working with people, and you care about these people and you advocate for them. And she taught me a lot about that. And so she was like, she was my primary supervisor. She was the one that signed off on everything. And then I had Camille Ngueni, who is one of the most interesting people on the planet. If you ever get a chance to meet him, he kind of keeps a low profile, but definitely somebody who you want to meet and you want to have in your circles. He taught me what it was like to be that person hands-on and be in the trenches with the people that you're working with. When you're walking into a family home or you're intervening, you are in the mix of it. And if you are just going to walk in and tell people what to do and then leave, you're not going to get this buy-in. But if you are hands-on, nitty-gritty, dirty with these families, you're going to have way more success. And that's a lot of what he taught me. And then the third supervisor that I have, he wasn't my direct supervisor, but he was more of like a mentor, and I still consider him my mentor now, is an instructor at FIT named Bill Carlucci. And he taught me a lot about just thinking critically about the science and thinking critically about what we're doing. When you look at interventions and how they align, when you look at, just the 7 dimensions specifically, like really digging into the idea of the 7 dimensions, he taught me all about what that looks like and how to really apply it in a meaningful way and stay true to the science. So I'd say those 3: Don Demoli, Camille Nguyen, and Bill Carlucci are my 3 people.
Awesome. Do you have any tips for possibly incoming graduate students or colleagues that are maybe looking to continue their education?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest tip I would say is not necessarily about the programs themselves. It's a matter of knowing what you want to do. I meet a lot of people, and a lot of people ask me, about PhD programs and ask about doctoral programs. And my first question is always, why? Why do you want to do it? Because it is a lot of work. And a lot of times it's a lot of work that doesn't have the kind of payoff that people think, especially working in like social sciences and helping professions. You don't get a pay raise. I didn't get a raise when I completed my PhD. Like, that wasn't a thing that they were like, oh yeah, like, here you go, doctor. They were like, okay, cool, congratulations, keep doing what you're doing. And so I always ask people, when you're going into any program like that, what do you want to do with it? What do you want to be when you grow up? Because if you want to be a clinician and you want to be a practitioner and you want to do research and you want to do all that stuff, you can do that with a master's degree. As a matter of fact, you could do it with a bachelor's degree if you really found the right avenues. It's just a matter of finding the right avenues. I think people tend to look at going from associates through their PhD as the linear progression, and it certainly is, but it's not the only path to where people want to go. So that's what I always say is, like, ask yourself what you want to do with it. Sometimes you don't even need a certification to go do what you want to do. Like, if you want to work in animal behavior, you do not need to be a BCBA to do it. And so just kind of keep people thinking about that and getting creative about that is always that's my biggest go-to when people ask me stuff.
And see, I think you brought up multiple points. If you look into like the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, when you read the first few authors of an article, generally they are doctors, or so I feel like sometimes that could, for us graduate students, we look at it like, oh, we need to have our doctorate to even be on these articles or be in multiple, like to be cited multiple times. So I think that's kind of interesting, like the point that you brought up.
Yeah, and I mean, like, if you look at, I would say, like, because I mean, I have colleagues and friends who have published in JABA and in the behavior analyst, which is now Perspectives on Behavioral Science, and verbal behavior and all that, and they published their thesis as a study. Like, so they're master's level students. That's the first publication they have, and they're published with people like Ray Miltenberger and Tim Vollmer, and they have those names on it, but they are students. So I think it just really depends on what you want to do. And I would hazard a guess that most people that work in our field don't get into the field just to do research. They probably want to go be clinicians, and you don't really need a doctorate to do that. So I think it gives you a little bit more clout. Sure, like, there are a lot of perks to being a doctor, like, but I'll tell people all the time, like, the biggest change for me after I became a doctor was having to tell people just to call me Shane. Mm-hmm. Like, like, I was already doing all the things that I wanted to do, within my field. And so the biggest change was me literally saying, like, hey, please call me Shane. You don't have to call me doctor. Please call me Shane. So
we'll kind of go into our next topic, which is generally about thesis, but you can choose which one you find more interesting, your dissertation or thesis.
Oh, okay. So I actually didn't do a thesis.
Simple enough.
Yeah, simple enough. So dissertation it is. So So my dissertation is titled Understanding Self-Care Among Currently Certified Behavior Analysts. So I had done one of the first qualitative studies exploring whether or not behavior analysts actually take care of themselves as practitioners, and starting to look at those indicators of burnout and things like that within that.
How did you get interested in the topic?
Yeah. So how did I get interested? I would say that the catalyst for me was, if you ever go to a behavior analytic conference and you ever just kind of sit back and watch everybody, you'll see a lot of people that I don't want to say party, but they drink heavily. And that's kind of an interesting thing that you'll hear in our field, is that you'll hear like, oh, it's, we're going to go get a drink, and you'll see, like conferences or like these party times, and that's all fine and dandy. Like, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but what I was seeing and kind of what I was noticing was that a lot of people were doing that and not fixing any problems that they were having. They were burning out, and then they were, also drinking themselves silly. And, that's kind of where I started exploring it a little bit. And coming from a clinical psychology background, they talk about self-care a lot and the ethics around self-care. And I was kind of comparing the fields and not really seeing a lot of discussion around that with behavior analysts. And so, and then on top of that, it became like this really cool buzzword. Like, it's a really cool hashtag. If you go on Instagram and you look at self-care, it's like vacations and wine and getting, manicures and pedicures or whatever it is. It looks really cool, but I think people misunderstand that. And so it becomes this really cool thing. And it ends up being like, setting boundaries, like telling people no is a really great self-care tool. Getting enough sleep at night or eating enough food is really great self-care. And I think that when we start exploring that topic, we're missing some of these other really important aspects of it. And so I got interested because I was seeing people struggle with taking care of themselves. I was seeing behavior analysts start to burn out. I mean, I had several colleagues who have ended up in pretty serious situations where they have attempted suicide, or they have had really intense burnout where they've left the field entirely. And, I think it's a bigger problem than we give it credit for.
Personally, I feel like I've learned a lot about this recently in terms of burning out.
Yeah.
The other day, I saw a picture on Instagram, and I keep bringing it up in almost every interview I've had because it's really important. It said, "Dear BCBA, work, but don't forget to live." And I think that stands out so much because I feel as if a lot of people who graduate from these graduate programs, all they know about is working in like early intervention. So they start working at a clinic, they get a 20-kid caseload, then they're overwhelmed, they're not enjoying what they're doing, they're not learning, and they're always stressed out. So I would honestly be kind of interested in learning if like there's any quantitative data comparing clinical settings versus maybe academia or animal behavior. I'd be kind of interested in learning.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say this too. What's interesting about it is that there is not a lot of research in general about the behavior analyst in relation to self-care. I mean, every bit of research that I was able to pull was from clinical psychology, counseling, nursing even. And there's not a lot on behavior analysts. As a matter of fact, we don't do a good job of studying ourselves as part of our research. We do a really great job of observing everybody else's behaviors, right? Like, we can sit down and define what your behavior looks like, and we can measure it, and we can record it, and we can intervene on it and do all this really great stuff. But we have such a hard time looking at ourselves and turning that lens back on ourselves as practitioners, unless it has to do with ethics. And then we want to, like bring the torches and the pitchforks to town whenever somebody commits like some kind of ethical violation. And so I don't know. I think that when you start looking at it, and I think part of it too is people have a hard time with the term self-care because it is a little bit fluffy and people have a hard time defining it. But there are behavioral indicators of burnout that you can cite, like over self-medicating, canceled sessions, effectiveness of treatment. Like, those are all variables that you can look at, and behaviors specifically, measurable behaviors and outcomes that are related to this stuff. And I don't think that people realize that it gets that deep when you really dig into it.
Yeah, for sure. With your dissertation, since we're kind of on the topic, and there may be listeners out there honestly contemplating this or going through these troubles that you keep bringing up, do you have any tips, or was there like a conclusion to some of the, I guess, tips that could help those who may be experiencing this dilemma?
Yeah. So we, as part of there were a few behavior analysts that kind of banded together. We started it's the BCBA mental health support group. So there is a mental health support group on Facebook that is available to behavior analysts right now. We haven't opened it up to RBTs or graduate students and all that, but I believe that there is like a splinter group somewhere that has done that. But I feel like the main thing is just recognizing what okay. The example that I give is this: I was working with an RBT, and she was going through a whole lot of stuff. She had a lot of stuff happening in her life, and so I had her sit down and kind of give me how many hours are you spending taking care of your grandparents? How many hours are you spending working? How many hours are you spending school? Like if you could spend it in school, how much time would you be doing that? And it ended up being that altogether, all the stuff that she had on her plate was like 144 hours worth of stuff per week.
Wow.
There's literally not that much time in a week. So I was like, and that doesn't even include sleeping. So I had to tell her, this is the stuff, like even just starting to recognize what your signs of burnout are, I think is the biggest first step. And then being able to figure out what you need. Do you need to tell people no? Do you need a mental health day? Do you, what support or what system or what do you need personally to make sure that you are okay? And, if it means taking your meds every day, if it means, taking a day off in the middle of the week, if it means connecting with a colleague and just kind of venting, like whatever that looks like, there's got to be something there. You have to figure out what your own self-care behavior looks like, though.
Since you're on the RBT topic, I think that's really interesting because I am sure there are quite a few RBTs out there experiencing that, because going from being an RBT to a BCBA, there is quite a big jump in pay. So when you get caught in that dilemma where possibly you want to go get into a graduate program, but you have all these other expenses, but you love what you're doing now, you may be overwhelmed working with all these clients and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot. I mean, I think that there are plenty of studies about graduate students and suicide rates among graduate students. There's plenty of stuff about dropout rates that have to do with programs. I mean, the data's out there. And self-care in itself is a very broad topic. I mean, in the research, there's 139 separate definitions that we could find as of 2012. And they did a meta-analysis, and you could find that. And that's a lot. That's a lot of kind of discrepancy among this topic. But, I mean, it was originally created for people working in helping professions. It's a nursing model. It's a nursing theory, the theory of self-care. And it doesn't make any sense not to apply it to what we're doing. And yeah, as an RBT, like you said, it is a pretty big, wage jump. But at the same time, you've got somebody who is, like you said, I'm working full time on my cases because I've got to pay my bills. A lot of these people that are doing this are parents too. They're going to grad school. They've got family obligations. They've got these other things that are all part of that pie that have to do with self-care. And yeah, some people have a hard time balancing it. Some people can't balance it. There's literally no wiggle room and you just have to push through it. But, I think that is the challenge. And as behavior analysts, as people who have been in the field for a long time, I think that we have an obligation to help kind of foster a system where it's okay to say no, and it's okay to take a break, and it's okay to, be vulnerable, because I don't think that we have done that very well.
So my last question for your dissertation would be, what were some of the challenges? I know you said you had a hard time finding studies, but what about personal life? Did you have a hard time writing that many pages for your dissertation? Are you a pretty good writer? How did that work out?
So I didn't have a lot of challenges as far as my writing. I feel like I'm a pretty good writer. My challenge more was with the university itself. What ended up happening was in the middle of my dissertation, my chair left. And so I ended up losing contact with the person who was responsible for my entire dissertation. And that delayed me quite a bit. And but I mean, as far as other challenges, we had plenty of participants. I think that we were calling for 10, and I ended up getting 257 people interested in taking participating. Yeah. So I mean, that to me spoke to that social significance piece, right? People thought this was an important topic. So participants weren't an issue. The study itself, the design wasn't an issue. It was a semi-structured interview. It was a qualitative study, which is funny to think of a behavior analyst doing a qualitative study, but it was important. And my biggest challenge was just with the university. So, and once I got a new chair, she was great and didn't have any issues going through it. So my dissertation's about 140 something pages, but you just chip away at it like a bigger project.
Man, that sounds miserable.
It sounds daunting, but it's like I liken it to Michelangelo's David, right? Michelangelo's David started as a slab of marble, and you had to chip away at it to get to that final piece. And if you spent a day writing a page or reading a few articles and all that, it happens very quickly. And so it's just a matter of understanding that as okay, so I want to get my PhD. That's a big thing. and looking at those different components and where those smaller steps are, almost like a task analysis. And so I think I benefited from being a behavior analyst walking into a PhD. I think that somebody who doesn't have that experience might have been a little bit overwhelmed with it.
I'm just like thinking, I mean, if you think about it, 144 pages, if you have 5 years, I mean, you may have started your dissertation like the last 2 years. I'm not really sure how that works out, but I mean, that's like a half a page a day at most.
Yeah. I mean, and so then you write, and then you get a lot of people that, or not a lot of people, you get a few people that read it and they tell you to revise it, and then you revise it, and then they go, where did this part go? And you say, well, you told me to take that out. And they're like, put it back in. And I'm like, you're wasting my time, man. Like, so, you have those moments, but, I think it was I had a really great experience with my dissertation, even though it is a big project, only because it taught me to think really critically about the way you design research and the importance of the different types of research that are out there. It does give you a unique perspective that I don't think that you can get as a clinician.
Awesome. So we'll go ahead and go to our next topic, but where are you working at now? What was your life like following graduating, I guess, either or program?
Yeah. So when I first graduated and I first became a BCBA, I was working at a small agency. I worked at this little agency called Therapeutic Foundations. And I say small, but they weren't small. But they were a local agency, definitely a mom and pop type of space. And they were really great. And I ended up leaving there because I wanted to get some experience working with some younger children. They weren't taking anybody that was an adult at the time. And so I wanted to get some experience and kind of expand my toolbox. And so I joined Positive Behavior Supports. So I currently work there. And I've been there for 7 years. Actually, I'm going on, I think, 8 years this year. So I've been there for a long time. But my current role is I'm the Director of Training and Dissemination. So my job now is I'm a one-man department, a couple of people that kind of are mingled with it. But for the most part, I'm like the only person that works in my department. And what I do is I develop a lot of content for trainings. I manage all of our training systems. I manage some of our supervision systems and work within that realm. So my life, I would say, has not been different from when I graduated my PhD, except for, like I said, I have to tell people to call me Shane. Like, I'm not comfortable being called Dr. Spiker yet, even though it sounds cool. And so, but after I graduated with my master's degree, it was a pretty big jump. And you'll experience this too when you get there and you move from being an RBT and a graduate student into a master's level position. I mean, the amount of responsibility is in a totally different space. And it's an astronomical jump. And so that was the biggest adjustment for me, was like, oh, now I'm responsible for these cases. Okay, so I was just an RBT. The BCBA was responsible. Now I'm responsible for these cases. And if something goes wrong, it's my fault and my certification on the line. So that realization was probably the hardest thing for me.
So it sounds like you've enjoyed where you're working at now, but is there anything you wish you knew before you started at the practice where you are currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and maybe just as a general practitioner, I would say that the one thing I wish I knew was to say no more, only because, when I first, I always remember I had a supervisor once tell me that I was too bright and shiny, and that being in the field would make you jaded. And that, working here will make you really jaded. And I was like, I don't think so. Like, I'm a pretty optimistic dude. And so, but I also understand where a lot of the jadedness comes from. And it comes from having repeated failures and working outside of your scope and burning out. And so I wish that I had somebody or had known to say no better when opportunities came up, because even though those have shaped my career and shaped my profession, there were times where I was supervising somebody, early on, and I shouldn't have been supervising. I was not capable or ready to do that in a really effective way. And so I would say that's probably the biggest lesson, is ease your way into it. Do not jump head first into it, or you're going to lose your mind.
Do you have any tips for those possibly looking for a job? Is there anything that they should watch out for? Caseloads, any questions that they should ask the employer when they finally have their interview? Any tips on that?
Yeah, there's a really great article. It's Broadhead et al. I can't remember what year it is, but they give some really good tips on how to identify ethical organizations. So I think that is a great place to start when you're looking to work somewhere. But actually, one of the best pieces of advice and one of the most bizarrely behavior analytic and out of left field experiences that I had was talking to Tyra Sellers, who is the director of ethics at the BACB right now. She's absolutely wonderful. And if you ever get a chance to listen to her speak or to talk about anything or read any of her articles, she is one of the best, if not the best, as far as supervision goes and really conceptualizing ethics. And so she told me one time that we were talking about gut reactions, right? Like we all have gut reactions. And I remember saying, I've had to learn to trust my gut reactions when it comes to stuff. And she said, what is a gut reaction but respondent behavior? You're responding to something in your environment. You're responding to stimuli. A gut reaction is some respondent response to some kind of salient stimuli in your environment. You are attending to something that is giving you that reaction. So what is it? And it's your job to figure out what that is. So once I kind of heard that and realized like, yeah, gut reactions are important, that was really helpful for kind of walking through some of these steps. I don't know that I have any tips for maybe other than like negotiate your salary. Like definitely say what you need, but I think, there's some cool resources out there that I would contact and kind of figure out what your own framework is for that.
Yeah, I'll have to try to find that ethical organization article and try to throw that in the show notes. But since we're on the note of Tyra Sellers, I actually just recently met her at the Missouri Association of Board Analysis conference that we just have. And one of the key things that she talked about was like learning how to unicorn your supervisory practices. So it's pretty interesting.
I love that talk. She talks about not being that zombie, right? Like the zombie, like the bad supervision is like a zombie infection. And like you want to be the
crazy.
unicorn. Yeah. She's absolutely right. I mean, supervision is like one of the first places that does really influence the field. I mean, that's where a lot of our foundational skills are started. And so, yes, I would say if it has to do with supervision, trust Tyra on anything that she has to say about it. She is 100% right. She changed my entire supervisory game.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
What's your long-term plans in the field of behavior analysis?
My long-term, I think that I want to be, I know that I want to be a professor, but I don't think of it as like long-term goals. Like I don't think I have really any long-term plans. I'm of the mindset that I love what we do. I love our science. I think that we have the power to do some really great things. And I really struggle with people that can't see that, see the potential in our field or see what good we can do. And so I think long-term plans are just continue to disseminate good science. I do want to be a professor at a university, and I think that's probably where I'm going to end up is like really, I'm teaching now at a couple of universities, but I think that that's where I want to end up is being fully staffed, tenured at a university, working in academia, and training the next generation of behavior analysts to come up. But I think my biggest thing is just continue to do good work and do good science.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. Are you looking into maybe teaching classes that will revolve around the BACB like coursework design, or maybe possibly different subjects other than behavior analysis?
So I like I said, I finished my clinical psychology degree, and I really enjoyed the idea of that realm, the social sciences. But I do find myself always coming back to behavior analysis and behaviorism in general. And as a matter of fact, I almost got kicked out of my program because I was the only behavior analyst, and I would constantly argue with my psychodynamics teacher about that. He would be like, well, Freud had this. And I was like, yeah, but the parts of Freud's stuff that worked were behavioral, so we didn't get along very well. And, so I constantly find myself being in that realm of behavior analysis. I imagine I'm going to stay there. I don't see my theoretical framework shifting at all. So I don't, but I certainly, what I'll say though with that piece is that I don't even want to say that I'll stay in behavior analysis simply because I didn't think that I would end up here when I first started. Like I never thought that I would specialize working with sex offenders. Never thought that was in my scope or in my radar ever, and just fell into it and absolutely love working with that population. And so, I'm of the mindset where it's like say no where you can, but like say yes to really cool opportunities if you get a chance to learn, because you never know where you're going to end up.
Definitely. So we are going to go ahead and start wrapping things up. So I have about 2 final questions for you.
Yeah.
So when you started this entire journey, your journey was quite a bit different the most, but I think you truly do have an inspiring story. But what advice do you wish you could have told yourself in the beginning, or what is something that you know now that you didn't know, or what would you have done differently if you could go back?
Hmm. That's a really great question. Um, I think that I would say no to more things. But in a way that was like, maybe I would measure things a little bit more closely. I made a lot of mistakes in my field, and not nobody got hurt or anything like that. But I feel like I spent a lot of time in a very trial by fire situation, and a lot of situations were really, it could have gone a different way. And so I would say, just if I could go back and tell myself anything, I would say slow down. And that's okay. You don't have to learn everything right now. I wish the one thing that I would have heard early on in my career is that we work as scientists, and for scientists, there is no finish line. Like, to me, that was a really important revelation that I heard later in my career that I had not even thought of. And that goes back to the idea of philosophic doubt, right? With new data comes new interventions and all that. And I wish that I had learned that sooner. Andrew Hooverus said that on a Facebook post. It's kind of a throwaway thing real quick. But he said, we're scientists. There is no finish line. And that's okay. You have to be okay with that because we're lifelong learners. So I think I wish I would have realized that sooner.
Yeah. So Shane, I'm gonna go ahead and ask you one last final question. Where can listeners find out more about you and your dissemination efforts? Are there any social media platforms that they can follow you on? Do you have a podcast?
Yeah. So we do. So a couple things. I am one of the co-hosts on the Why We Do What We Do podcast. So work with Abraham and people like Ryan O'Donnell and all them. I've been working with that crew for a few years. So check us out on that. That's a fun podcast to check out and listen to. And we kind of take it's behavior analytic in nature. Like, it's got a behavioral bent, but we tackle things like mad cow disease and and like just really like sensory integration. We try to take those things that are like psychological and like things that people kind of believe and dispel a lot of myths, which is a lot of fun. So I would say there, if you want to just kind of check out just what I'm doing in general, I'm on Instagram at Dr. Shane T. Spiker, just one word. And I'm in there, and I usually post up anytime I'm doing trainings or traveling or any of those things. So, but yeah, I think those are the two main spaces. Can't think of anything else off the top of my head that I'm working on. So that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, well, thank you for being on the show today, Shane. It's been a pleasure of a time talking to you, and I have truly learned quite a bit from your story, and I think your story is a little bit different than most, especially since you did get 2 master's programs, but overall it sounds like you've had quite the life experience.
Yeah, I'm so gray from all of it. So I mean I did all this before 30. I just turned 34 last month, so I did all this very, very early on. So just like I said, just have fun with it. So I appreciate you doing this podcast. I think it's a really cool thing that you're doing, and I think that it's great to show that behavior analysts are human beings too. And we have some stuff to say that I think is going to be pretty unique.
Awesome. Thanks, Shane. I'll talk to you later.
All right, sounds good. Talk to you soon.
Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Shane. This conversation was a pretty long podcast, but as with all my other podcasts, I believe it holds valuable and critical information. And to be honest, I learned quite a bit, especially about doctorate programs. Don't forget, you can follow the Behavior Trap podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcast, and Google Podcast. And if you're enjoying these podcasts, then give this podcast a 5-star rating on wherever you're listening to this. Some positive reinforcement goes a long way. Looking forward to talking to more everyday behavior analysts. See ya!